All right, one of my favorite segments of the week, and we get right into it, coming out of the weekend with lots to discuss regarding the Winnipeg Jets offseason, of course, the Stanley Cup playoffs. Always a pleasure to welcome in the one and only Dave Poulin. Since we last spoke, the Jets season ended. Obviously, it was a disappointing year for Winnipeg. They did win their final 4 games. But over the course of the last week or so, well, maybe the last 2 weeks, we heard a number of very interesting comments, and some would say damning comments from a number of members of the Winnipeg Jets. Nikolai Ehlers, Kyle Connor, Paul Stastny. But the final day of the regular season, 2 people spoke, and we're still talking about it right now. Paul Stastny was some of the most damning comments I have ever heard from a National Hockey League player at the end of the season about teammates and the lack of respect for each other. And then a Mark Scheifele media address that was in stark contrast to just about everybody else on the team, talking about himself, what he needs to hear about the future of the team going forward. I mean, that's just added sort of fuel to many fires about what has been wrong with this hockey club. I mean, I know you're talking about this and the National Hockey League with the guys. I mean, what do you make of the end of the Jets season and what we're hearing from some of the most important members of the hockey club publicly?
Certainly disappointing to hear, but not a surprise in that this is a team with very high expectations, and it was a very disappointing season. So something has to give. And what gave is a whole lot of individual comments on what each person thought was the issue. Now, let's start with Stastny. That's a veteran player. And he's been there a couple of times and chose to come back. And so, that perspective is sort of an insider and an outsider versus someone who's only been in one locker room. And then, hey, listen, I love candor at the year-end meetings. I also never liked exit meetings. I didn't like them as a player. I didn't like him as a coach, and I didn't like him as a manager. And I talked to a veteran coach this week, and I said, how were your exit meetings? He goes, oh, they were just great. Every player knows exactly what he has to do over the summer. Every player is going to have a great summer. Every player is going to come back. And, and at the end, you just look at them and go, and what about last year? Like, did you think the same thing last year before summer started? And so I think it's a time where a great deal can be learned, but you also have to take it in the sense that the frustration, the disappointment, the anger, and hey, listen, I know comments were made by Mark Scheifele about himself. Every player is thinking about himself. I mean, he's one who happened to mention it. Every single player is thinking about himself because that's what's going to happen. They know it's a business. They know that they're, as likely to be in conversations as anybody else is because the team lost. You have to win to eliminate all this, Andrew. And every locker room has its issues. Winning locker rooms have their issues. And you don't hear about them because you can't talk like that when you win. You simply can't. And everybody will look at you like, well, you must be the problem because everything else is fine. It's not fine. And you have to continue to build. I believe there's going to be a significant change in Winnipeg because the team hasn't won. And so if the key pieces aren't in place to win, then you have to make changes and you have to evaluate which key pieces are going to stay moving forward.
Dave, I mean, we can talk about what the Jets did and didn't do on the ice this year, but it's pretty clear from what we've heard from players and certainly what seems to be coming out in the aftermath of the season that there has been, it has been a less than ideal dressing room, and there's major questions about the leadership group of this club for the last little while. From a perspective of a management, and you've been in management before, how important is that team dynamic? I mean, these are things that, there's no charts for, there's no analytics for, but how important is that team dynamic? And if you do subscribe to the fact that the Jets have gone in a very poor direction in that way, how big of a job is it for the next head coach to come in, and how difficult will it be to establish a new culture?
Well, it has to be done. It's not just up to the head coach either. It's up to the players involved. And management will have conversations with each player, and they know a number of the players and they know them well. And I would expect those conversations to be incredibly candid. I mean, it doesn't make any sense on either side, a veteran player or management to pull any punches. I mean, you've got to be candid with what's going on, and you've got to improve the situation. But I also think there are a lot of really good pieces in place, and I think it can happen pretty quickly. And everyone talks about changing the culture, and it starts with the players. It starts with a group of players, and it starts with players that want to win and wants what's in the best interest of the team. And then by doing that, if you walk in the locker room, you have to assimilate. You have no choice. And I was a part of probably 4 or 5 really good locker rooms. And I say that, you would say, well, you only played for 3 teams. Well, in Philly, I was a part of 3 different, very good locker rooms. And in Boston, I was a part of 2 very good locker rooms, distinctly different in the 3.5 years. And in Washington, in my 1.5 years there, we got good for a small fraction of the time. And when I walked in, that was a very fractured locker room. So it's up to the individuals in the locker room to change it, to want to change it, but the coach steers the ship. And you don't just come in and put new signs up and say, oh, we got a new culture. We're going to read this word on the way out, or we're going to read this word on the way out. It's a lot of work. And it takes trust, and it takes honesty. And it starts right, at the forefront in the exit meetings, when you have to determine which players you want to be a part of it moving forward. And then the players too. I mean, they got to determine they want to be a part of it moving forward as well.
Well, absolutely. And I mean, I think all of that is very pertinent to what's happening here in Winnipeg. It will not surprise you in the least that social media in Winnipeg right now, every second tweet is mentioning the name Barry Trotz. About as good of a resume as there is right now amongst head coaches, one of the most respected names, and of course, a guy with Manitoba roots. What is it that Barry Trotz does so well? And assuming that you think he would be a good fit, how impactful do you think that a Barry Trotz, if the Jets could possibly get him to sign and come here as a head coach, the difference that he could make going where they need to go, considering what's happened in the past few years with this hockey team?
So there's a whole lot here. Let's start with the Manitoba roots. As you and I discussed briefly, he lists himself from Winnipeg. He's not from Winnipeg. He's from Dauphin. And you can't borrow Winnipeg on your resume. Now, the University of Winnipeg might have something to do with it, but I always had this conversation with the Mahovliches, and because they're from Schumacher. And, people say, well, they're from Timmins. They're from the suburbs. Donnie Lever's from South Porcupine. He's not from Timmins. And we always joked about it. And I know Trotz said, I actually looked at his hockey DB to make sure he was listed from Winnipeg. But naturally, when one of the best coaches in the National Hockey League becomes available, there's going to be conversation. And everyone would love to tie them, themselves to Barry Trotz. And by the way, he was gifted to the Islanders. He won a Stanley Cup and wasn't renewed. And Lou Lamoriello, gift package, here's your coach. Takes him to the conference finals a couple of times, has the most disjointed year of any team this year by starting the first month plus on the road because of the building. Goes through the same COVID stuff as everybody else does, but that on top of being on the road for the first month of the season, and then gets fired. And the trade deadline, there wasn't a single question asked of me about, well, what about the Islanders? Because for me, it was the trust that people have in both Lou and Barry Trotz. And the only thing they did at the trade deadline was sign extensions for Cal Clutterbuck and Zach Parise. That's it. And so I was really surprised by the news today. Something happened, and whether it was, I can't think it was based on what has happened. I have to think it was based on what was going to happen. And I say that, I don't think you can fault Trotz with coming in and taking the worst defensive team in the league and making them the best defensive team in the league, basically without changing virtually any personnel, just coaching them. And so I think it must have been about future direction. I don't know that, but just from the seat I sit in, why would you remove a coach who's won there with a roster that didn't overwhelm and yet got to the Final Four the last 2 years? So the availability won't just, have piqued the interest of Winnipeg Jets fans, or it's piqued the interest of a lot of people. Now, Darren Dreger has reported that that Barry may have some interest, or sources say Barry may have some interest in the management side of things. He still has a year left in his contract, so that would have to be dealt with. But when a manager like that, coach like that becomes available, boy, oh boy, of course, who knows, Andrew? So I have 5 job openings right now, and I have another 5 where they're either interim or, something could happen. There could be as many as 10 clubs in the National Hockey League who currently have an interim coach. But I say that about Montreal. Montreal's going to keep the guy they have, obviously. So somewhere between 5 and 8 teams probably are looking or maybe looking for coaches. So Barry Trotz, all of a sudden just jumped up near the top of that list.
Well, and one of the things that we heard consistently from players over the last month, Dave, when talking about this lost season, was that there was a lack of buy-in on a number of members of the club, and there was a real lack of accountability. Those two seemed like almost the hallmark of what Barry Trotz does on day one. Just your thoughts on him as a coach, and the impact that he could have on a team like the Winnipeg Jets.
I've always liked him as a coach. He was our minor league coach when I played in Washington. He was coach of Maine at that time, Portland. And so I knew him a little bit from then, but not a lot. He was a young coach, pretty close to my age, I think. And just a young coach who was making his way. And then I watched with interest as David Poyle left there and he became the first hire in Nashville. Loved the way Nashville teams played. Always thought they were undermanned and that he got a great deal out of what he had. And never quite got to coach the team. And then when he got to Washington, that was a team that had not had a lot of success under some pretty good coaches. He managed to figure out that puzzle and took them to the ultimate place, with a guy that a lot of people said you couldn't win with, and that was Alexander Ovechkin. And there was so much talk about Washington's locker room over the years and the Ovechkin factor. And I just think he does put the structure in place. He's demanding, but I think above all, he's fair and honest with you. And, anybody that's played for him will tell you that. He's straight up and doesn't sugarcoat things, tells you what he needs and tells you what he expects, and then demands it of you. And maybe most importantly, makes you demand it of yourself. Because as I've said, it's got to come down to the locker room. It's got to come down to the guys in the locker room. Because the most important time for a coach, I believe, are the 2 minutes after he walks out of a locker room. He goes, the coaches are gone. What's the next thing said and who says it? And that'll tell you the direction a hockey team's going in. And if whatever he said is reinforced and it's reinforced by the key people, then that becomes the norm. And if what he said is questioned by anyone after he leaves the locker room, then you've got a problem in the locker room. Unless it's a healthy question and it's meant for conversation.
Dave Poulin with us here on Winnipeg Sports Talk Daily. Just before we get to the playoffs, Dave, I mean, considering everything we know about the Winnipeg Jets, the things that, were issues for them this year, I mean, Trotz aside, when if you had your management hat on, what type of coach makes the most sense for this team next season?
Well, I always kept a piece of paper in my top left drawer, and I think I've mentioned this before, and I always had names on it. And there were names of guys I liked. But the names moved around according to what I thought my team was like at that point. And, I had the chance to be involved in the hiring of a couple of coaches and went through the process. But it really depends on where your organization or your team is. I think right now, this team probably demands a pretty veteran guy. And, hey, there are some good young coaches out there, but I think for the curve they're at, I think they're further along. This isn't a team that, I'm asked about Detroit. Well, the last time Stevie Yzerman had a decision like this with a young team like this, his choice was John Cooper, who he literally, Andrew, pulled out of the United States Hockey League, the Green Bay Gamblers, put him in Norfolk for a couple of years. He won there. And then, this young hotshot lawyer who'd only coached in junior hockey and a couple of years in the American League was coaching in the National Hockey League. And so, when I'm asked what Stevie Yzerman will do in Detroit, my thought is, well, what has he done in the past? He hired a pretty young coach and he let the coach grow with the team. as has happened in Tampa, and then was patient with it. And they went through a lot in Tampa. And I think that this is a pretty veteran squad in Winnipeg right now. And that may demand a little different style of coach. And there are some veteran coaches, out there in the market, and we don't know who they all are yet. And that dust won't settle until the year is over. And who knew, as we sat here on Monday, that a Barry Trotz would be available, and who else may be available as we move forward. So, but I think it is a pretty veteran coach. Now, that veteran coach could also be a veteran coach who's a longtime associate head coach and been through a bunch of experiences and been a head coach in the American League, maybe an associate coach in the NHL. I've got a couple of thoughts on a couple of good prospects like that. A guy like Dean Evason, who fits that profile perfectly. He'd been a successful head coach in the American League, and I'd watched him when I was in management, and he was one of the names at the top of my list in my top left drawer when I said, if I'm ever going to hire a coach, there's a guy I want to talk to.
Poulin, always great having you on Winnipeg Sports Talk. Enjoy the games, particularly Game 5, Tampa Leafs, which you'll be working, and we'll look forward to catching up real soon as the Stanley Cup continues, and we maybe get a little closer to some clarity as to what will happen with this NHL team here in Winnipeg.
Thanks, Andrew. Enjoy the hockey.